A young neighbor to my former parish visited on a Sunday morning, and immediately at the end of the service, he asked for an appointment to see me later. When he walked into my office, he wasted no time with getting down to why he had asked to see me. Who do you think you are to fill this church with a bunch of homosexuals and tell them that it's all right with God for them to be gay? He was angry, but he was also visibly troubled. He had been a lifelong active member in a Methodist church. He attended with his family, played in the bell choir. He was the best bell choir player I've ever seen. He could do a solo bell choir performance that was amazing. He had gone on church mission trips. He had immersed himself in Bible study, in prayer, and in church programs, much more so than most of his peers, because he had an extra motivation. He was using religion to keep himself safely imprisoned, to keep a core part of himself hidden from the light. A toxic secret that was killing him, that was keeping him, however, within the public expectations of his church and his family. We talked for hours that day about Scripture, the evolving nature of sexual mores in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and how I had arrived as a pastor and as a biblical scholar at the conclusion that is now shared by virtually all of the biblical scholarship world, that there is no reason to be prejudiced against gay people. Now, you would think that this young man who had felt imprisoned in a rigid, toxic, and cruel religious lie would be jumping for joy to realize that he really didn't have to do that, that he no longer had to pretend, he no longer had to deny himself the opportunity of falling in love, the chance to be fully actualized as a human being. But folks, that's not how enlightenment works. That's not how it happens. We all initially experience change, even change for the better, as loss. Some of us are better at it than others, but all of us experience change as a loss. A baby in the womb grows until their environment is crushing them. They are jammed into an airless space from which they must escape to survive, and yet they come into the world painfully and usually screaming their heads off. The young man that I met on that day never became my friend. He left my office after that first visit still very angry and deeply conflicted. He wanted to believe what I was saying, but he was unwilling to believe that all of his previous pastors, all of his previous Sunday school teachers, his parents had either lied to him or had been grievously mistaken. Now, he did continue to come to church, and about a year later, a very nice young man moved in with him, and they attended church together and continued to be very active, playing in the bell choir, until they moved out of state. Now, he was increasingly civil to me during that time, and I'm sure that somewhere deep inside of him, he may have even felt some gratitude, but he didn't like me. And I didn't make myself likable because I had been in his life something like a heart surgeon that insists on doing surgery without anesthesia. I really meant to be a liberator, but I have to tell you, I'm not always good at this. No preacher should ever tell stories in which they're the hero. But I tried to be a liberator in this young man's life, and I could say that I could duplicate that in story after story after story. I spent 16 years pastoring a church that was right on the edge of a large university, so that there were always students coming in that wanted to kind of explore this prejudice issue, for whom I was the first one to tell them, you can be Christian and gay. You can be who you are and still have a right relationship with God. but you never make friends as a liberator. I've never been able to make friends as a liberator. I really want to be a good guy. Inside my skin, I feel like a good guy. I feel like a kind and loving pastor, but I've never figured out how to be kind and loving while still being prophetic and relevant and being a liberator. So you make enemies. This business of enlightenment is tricky. For example, I avoid using Hitler as an example because he's overused, so I defer and go back even farther in history and talk about slavery. But if you just polled everyone here, there's not a single soul here who would argue that slavery was a good economic model. We would all quickly agree that owning another person and forcing them to surrender a lifetime of uncompensated labor is entirely evil. We've got that. But 150 years ago, the economy of the South was predicated on slavery as an economic system. Farmers made a huge upfront investment in labor when they purchased a slave, and so in spite of growing moral arguments against slavery, no other economic system arose. In other countries, they dealt with it. They shut off the slave trade. They restricted it. Governments compensated slave owners buying the freedom of their slaves. But in the United States, we didn't get to that. We just started shooting each other. Ending slavery came at the price of the most deadly war in our nation's history, and it plunged the southern states into poverty for more than a century. And you could argue that there are parts of our nation that have never recovered. Even so, there's no one who would argue in favor of going back to that economic system, except maybe for that Nevada cattle rancher, Cliven Bundy, and I suspect one of Kentucky's senators, Rand Paul. But when I say that their views don't count, what I mean is their views don't count. No one would want to go back to the 19th century practice of slavery, but you can understand why so many resisted the phenomenal suffering that changing their world would involve. When I leave our little gathering here on Sunday mornings of very reality-oriented, rational, critical thinking church members, and I drive by some of our neighborhood churches that are packed with hundreds or thousands of people who are, by virtue of where they are going, at least pretending to believe in the literal and historical truth that snakes can talk, that chariots can fly, who watch Noah's Ark as if it were a historical documentary. I just can't believe that so many people would feign acceptance of what is clearly Iron Age mythology, superstition, and magic. They force themselves into an intellectual girdle in which they have to defend the truth of the Bible that, for one example, clearly describes the earth as being flat, while simultaneously insisting that if anyone actually believed that the earth was flat, they'd have to be crazy. But for a couple of hours on Sunday morning, they visit the Flat Earth Society and do it without cognitive dissonance. The only reason why people would continue to embrace such absurdity in a scientific age, a post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolution, post-Einstein age, is that they feel it would cost them too much to leave the womb. As the Buddhist teacher Adyashanti says so clearly, enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with you being liberated or happier or better. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of everything that you've collected that is not true. It's seeing through the facade of the pretense of the mythologies that we're taught about, the mythology of America or the mythology of Christianity, because it is a complete eradication of everything we imagined to be true. No one, once they're liberated from that bondage of mythology with all of its neurotic guilt and fear, denial of reality, would ever be willing to go back into that intellectual prison. Once you're out of it, you don't want to go back. But leaving it is absolutely terrifying to those who are afraid, on the one hand, to let go of certainty, or at least the pretense of certainty, that everyone they've loved who's died is waiting for them in heaven and that they're going to go there too, or to abandon the social connections that they have through traditional religion. Most of the people I meet who tell me, I would like to go to your church, but it's the social connections of where they are, where they feel that they are tied in to family, friends, and neighbors. They may not believe 2% of what is said publicly in their churches, but they don't want to alienate themselves from those social connections. How can we be the source of liberation in the right way, in a way that's more like unlocking a cage than it's like cutting off someone's leg? That's a skill that I've yet to master. And if you're looking for me to teach a diplomacy class, you're barking up the wrong tree, I'm afraid. Still, the majority of our peers in the 21st century in Middle America will remain tangentially connected to a traditional church while their doubts continue to grow. They become more comfortable with just not going to church than they would be in trying to confront their doubts and find a faith community where their minds would be an asset rather than a liability. If you just quit going to a fundamentalist church, you can still have the pretense that that's your church. How many people do you know who say, I'm Catholic, but I haven't been for 40 years? They still self-identify with the church they no longer attend. They don't believe what that church teaches, but they can at least still hold on to the impression that they at least give assent to those that still go there. People are leaving traditional churches in large numbers. The majority of churches in the United States today have fewer than 40 people in attendance at their Sunday morning services. We see and we hear about the megachurches, but the overwhelming majority of churches in the United States have fewer than 40 people on Sunday mornings. But very few of the people who are leaving those churches will be willing to be entirely honest and say, I just don't believe that stuff anymore. I don't get enough out of going. I mean, I've got social collections and maybe there's some moral perspective and maybe we collectively do some things, but the bang isn't worth the buck. It's just not worth the effort and the time and the money that it takes to keep it going. They will instead almost always blame the institution rather than accept personal responsibility. It's the Catholic Church hid sexual molestation by priests. They'll say, I don't like the music program anymore. They're singing songs off the wall. I can't stand the music. Or the preacher is boring. Or the church is only interested in money. All they ever talk about is money. But they do not want to say to their family and church peers, I don't like your fairy tales anymore, and I'm not going anymore. Most of the founding fathers of the United States were not Christians. They professed a form of deism that you don't hear much about anymore. If you meet someone today who says they're a deist, they don't mean what George Washington or Thomas Jefferson meant by it. They were not atheists. They believed in a God, but they did not believe in the miracles and the magic and the truth claims of traditional Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. Thomas Paine, one of the most incredible writers of that time period, at the founding of the United States, predicted that there would be a revolution in religion to match the revolution in government. He was so excited by the change from the old European monarchies and systems of government in Europe to the democracy of the United States that he just knew that religion would follow suit. Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, and others were certain that the days in which religion could control the minds of the masses was over. And it looked like they were right for a while. But there was this huge revival called the Great Awakening. And it called people back to a very much fear of hell, need to be saved approach to faith. Every time you think that Iron Age view of religion is over, it has always managed to come back. In the United States, there was the Great Awakening, then there was the Second Great Awakening towards the end of the 19th century. There was a huge revivalist movement shortly after World War II. Most of the big churches in our city and in other cities were built for that huge baby boom post-World War II population where everybody went to church. If there was someone being introduced to the community in the newspaper, they listed who they were married to, how many kids they had, and where they went to church. That was how we identified people. In our day, it's no longer so. But churches that I grew up in, that you grew up in, remembered the days when you had to have Sunday night services and 3 services on Sunday morning to accommodate all of the people. And those buildings are now rising up to condemn them. But through our American history, there have been times when people tried to assert it again. Abraham Lincoln was really a deist in the sense that Madison and Jefferson was. He respected religious people who wanted to do good things, but he didn't have much use for the miraculous or the life after death or the soul stuff. 250 years later, we now see a generation that's much more likely to go to the lake for the weekend than to go to a progressive church, which of course leaves you to wonder if traditional religion ever was anything more than a form of enlightened self-interest. If the only reason you go to church is because you're scared of hell and you want to go to heaven, isn't that really just superstitious narcissism? I mean, it was never about making the world a better place or being a better person. If, however, you want to try to prevent warfare, to fight against injustice, to work to end poverty, to try to save the earth from environmental ruin, then a substantive faith is a real vehicle for doing that. You can say that science deals with what is, and religion speculates about what ought to be. But religion ought to be tied to science, that our speculation about what ought to be should deal with the reality of what is and not just wishful thinking. If religion only deals with what we wish should be true about, this world is corrupt and everything's bad, so we're all going to go to heaven and be happy after we suffer through this. An unhealthy religion denies the reality of the world we actually live in favor of an imaginary world that they just wish for. I'm grateful to find myself here in your company. I earnestly hope that our numbers grow and that communities like ours will arise from among the Church Alumni Association that exists in cities all over the world. A tradition has grown up around here in this church of you all applauding after every sermon I deliver, whether it merits applause or not. And I think now and then I've got it coming, but not every week. I appreciate, however, your generosity, but I think today I'd like to turn the tables. I applaud you for being the people who haven't given up, who discarded magic but stuck with the community to find deeper meaning and reason for hope. Applause, my friends. Oh.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.